Good morning, everyone. This is a webinar from the Center for Future Consciousness. And I'm Tom Lombardo. The graphics today are a combination of some new graphics that Terry has produced for this webinar, plus some old graphics that I created quite a number of years ago. And it's I think, an interesting combination with respect to the topic for today, which is going to be emotion and motivation. Um, so, uh, as I just mentioned, today we're going to be talking about emotion and motivation. This is webinar 11. It's part of the section on an ecological evolutionary theory of consciousness. And this first graphic we have up here, which Terry just recently created, I think captures visually, graphically, in its color and complexity, the topic of the day, emotion and motivation. This I thought was a beautiful and appropriate graphic for today. As you'll see, the graphics, as I mentioned, between what Terry produced and what I produced are rather different. And here's a graphic from me. Um, I've mentioned this before. The webinar series on the future evolution of consciousness aligns with a book I'm writing, and the link is up here for all of the chapters in the book series, and in particular, the chapter that aligns with the presentation today, Emotion and Motivation, I just put up a couple days ago, and the link is up there on the screen too. But keep in mind that in the outline that's up in the chat room, both of these links are there, so you can easily access the entire book or the link for the chapter today by just going to the outline, and you'll see where the links are provided for you in the outline. But the chapter is there today. The topic of emotion and motivation is such an intricate, complex, and interesting topic that it turned out that the presentation I'm presenting today is very complex and rich. And I would really recommend, since there's a lot of stuff that I'm going to go through, that to get a more in-depth and clear and organized sense of what I'm going to be talking about, it would be good to go and read the chapter. And also, as I've mentioned before, all of the videos aligning with this webinar series are up on my YouTube channel, and the webinar today will be hopefully up on the YouTube channel sometime very soon. Terry's real quick, so probably within the next week or so. Now, normally what I do at the beginning of any webinar is just do a quick review of the last webinar. And the last webinar was the first part of an ecological evolutionary theory of consciousness. And I talked about phenomenology and the epistemology of it and the pluralistic approaches to understanding consciousness. And I laid out certain fundamentals I believed regarding the nature of consciousness, how consciousness interfaces with the physical world in perception, how we have consciousness of our bodies, proprioception, and that the body indeed is conscious. And we're aware of our bodies through this consciousness that our bodies possess. I talked about the fundamental feature of purposeful behavior and how consciousness impacts the physical world through conscious, purposeful behavior. I discuss the personalization of consciousness, that consciousness, at least in humans, manifests itself as personalized. My consciousness feels personalized with a self. I talked about the fact that consciousness is not entirely private, but that we manifest our consciousness to each other. And I pulled all those parts together by saying that when we interact with each other, when we engage with the world, these fundamental features of consciousness, we all pretty much assume and operate within that mindset in our interactions with the world and with other humans, that we interact with the within a framework of I am a personalized, embodied consciousness, aware of the world around me, and I'm aware in this world around me of other personalized, embodied consciousnesses who are you, and with respect to me, and vice versa. And that we assume this in our interactions with each other. And those were some fundamentals regarding consciousness. Now, I wanted to move into what I think is a very basic and important aspect of our consciousness, which is going to be the dual qualities of emotion and motivation. And I have up here reference to my Future Consciousness book. And in my Future Consciousness book, there are three chapters, 10, 11, and 12, dealing with emotion and motivation as they pertain to future consciousness. I'm going to be a bit broader today and talk about consciousness in general, but if you want to look at what I say about emotion and motivation as it pertains to future consciousness, you can go look at my book, those three chapters. Now, the view I'm going to take after thoughtful consideration of all of this is that emotion and motivation are both fundamental and primordial phenomenological features of consciousness. Now, what that means is that they are distinctive and essential qualities of consciousness. And that, what I mean by consciousness there, they apply to us as well as at least all other creatures that possess consciousness, and that they have a prehistoric beginning in animal evolution. So that not only do we possess emotions, not only do we have a sense of motivation with respect to our life in the world, but animals have this too. And these two qualities are concomitant and connected with the other fundamental features of consciousness, which I've introduced: perception, proprioception, and purposeful behavior. They're connected into those. Now, my definitions of what emotion and motivation are, I'm going to be building up as I go through this presentation. But as a starting point, I'm going to focus in on the concept of feeling, which I take to be a key phenomenological, that is, experiential feature of conscious emotion and motivation. That is, in states of motivation, in states of emotion, we are experiencing feelings. And that's an essential part of what emotion is and what motivation is. In fact, from Antonio Damasio's book on the psychology and physiology of emotion, the title of his book, The Feeling of What Happens, is in reference to the experience of emotion. Now, I changed the expression slightly in that I see emotion as the feeling of what is happening, because emotion and our conscious experience is an ongoing process of happenings. But emotion also refers to feelings we have about what has happened in the past and feelings about what may happen in the future. So emotion is going to involve feelings that we have about, and notice I underline of, our current experience in the world, our past experiences in the world, and our anticipated future experiences in the world. Now, motivation, to bring motivation into the picture and connected with feeling, motivation is the feeling of what I am wanting or desiring. So I'm anchoring feeling to both emotion and motivation as being a key feature of both of those conscious psychological realities. Now, here's where we get into a bit of a challenge is understanding what the concept of feeling means. How do we define it? Now, I would suggest to begin with that feeling is a basic feature of consciousness and it is essential to consciousness. And without feeling, we would not possess consciousness. And I'm going to go into that in a little more depth, but it's in as I see it, feeling is something that's fundamental to the very nature of consciousness. But if we look at what the term feeling means, keeping in mind that, of course, other languages may have different terms that may be used with similar or nuanced alternative meanings. In English, feeling can refer to touch and skin sensations and perceptions, like feeling being touched, or through touch, feeling an object. And feeling can refer to ticklings and itchings on the skin. That's one meaning of feeling. Feeling can refer to bodily sensory proprioceptual experiences, like feeling the position of my body and my limbs, and feeling the tension in my body, or feeling movements in my body. It can refer to experienced bodily states, which could be diffuse or localized, like stomach gurgles and aches, dizziness, toothaches, headaches, feeling lazy, feeling energetic, feeling sleepy, feeling sick. So, feeling could refer to experienced bodily states, either localized, like a toothache or a headache, or diffuse, like feeling lazy and tired. Feeling could also refer to the experiences of pleasure and pain. And that is, bodily feelings can be either pleasurable or painful, or combinations of the two. So feelings could have valence in the sense that there could be positive feelings or there could be negative feelings, that is, pleasant or unpleasant feelings. And this is illustrative from this general question that we often ask each other: how do you feel? Do you feel good? Do you feel bad? Are you in pain? Are you feeling great? Etc., etc. Emotions, which fall under the category of feelings, are distinctive feeling states. For example, anger, an emotion, feels different than sadness, fear, or happiness. That is, we feel emotions, and emotions have distinctive phenomenological or conscious qualities. Okay, and these distinctive feeling states that are emotions are associated with distinctive neurochemical bodily states. So if we look at the neurochemistry of sadness versus anger versus happiness, we'll find differences in terms of the concentration of various neurotransmitters and other neurochemicals within the body and within the brain. So as our distinctive feeling states change, they are changing in conjunction with distinctive neurochemical changes in our body. So feeling has all of those different meanings, which includes emotion. Now, on the other hand, we can feel motives. That is, we can feel our desires and wants. We can feel hungry, or we could feel thirsty. We could feel horny. We could feel motivated or apathetic. We could feel satisfied or deprived. That is, motivation, among other things, is also a feeling state of consciousness. Now, there's a whole set of more complex kinds of feelings that we experience, like feeling frustrated, feeling in love, feeling confident, feeling insecure. And those are more complex than the kinds that I've just been talking about. So, um, feelings which encompass all of those different types of conscious phenomena above, my suggestion is that they are continuously present within our consciousness, often more than one kind of feeling at the same time, and they're a complex feature of consciousness. And as I said a little bit earlier, that they're essential to consciousness. Feelings could be bodily diffuse or localized. They could be intense or they could be mild. They could be clear, like I know I feel angry, or they could be ambiguous in the sense I know I'm feeling something, but I'm not sure what it is. We could attend to our feelings, whether it's bodily, emotional, motivational, or we could try to ignore them. Okay. Another key plurality with all of this is that our feelings could be pleasurable or they could be painful or somewhere in between. Now, given all that about the nature of feelings as a starting point, and keep in mind, we're going to build up ideas about emotion and motivation from that core concept of feeling. Um, this has direct application and significance to the hard problem of consciousness, in that an important part of the statement of the hard problem of consciousness is that consciousness refers to what does it feel that we have a feeling of our own existence. It seems to be taken as a defining feature of the very nature of consciousness when we get into these discussions about how is consciousness connected with the body and trying to understand that. And it seems to be clearly distinguishable from simply talking about physical states. So I could talk about the physical states in my body, but then if I introduce the fact that I'm having feelings of my existence or feelings in my consciousness, that seems to be something above and beyond simply the states of my physical body. But as you remember back from the previous webinar, I suggested to you that the body itself phenomenologically is experienced as conscious. That is, consciousness pervades the body. Consciousness doesn't feel like it simply exists up in the head. My hands feel conscious. My whole body feels conscious. That is, um, uh, feeling is a type of bodily consciousness in that I'm feeling my skin being touched, I'm feeling my stomach being upset, I'm feeling agitated and stressed. And so feelings are states of consciousness that the body has of its own reality. And without a body, we would not have conscious feelings. So, therefore, we have a paradox regarding the hard problem. We can imagine a physical entity without any feeling or consciousness, the zombie concept, something that looks and behaves in a very complex fashion, but presumably could potentially not have any feelings. And the hard problem distinguishes bodily states and conscious states. Yet it would appear that conscious feelings require a physical body, so that even if I make a distinction between bodily states and conscious feelings, if there were not a body or bodily states, one could not have conscious feelings. So the idea of a disembodied conscious being possessing feelings is impossible. That is, if we have this notion in our heads that one could have consciousness and it would possess feelings as part of it, but not have a body, that appears to be an impossibility. Now, sometimes, on the other hand, we'll say that our conscious self experiences feelings. That is, I feel angry, I feel sad, I feel hungry, I feel horny, I feel dizzy. Okay? Feelings seem to be an intrinsic experiential state of the conscious self. But given the bodily essence of feelings, we should consider that the conscious feeling self is ipso facto an embodied self. That is, when I say that I feel angry, the I that I'm referring to is my embodied self because the very notion of having feelings pertains to experiential states the body has of its own internal activity, its own states. So, given the ubiquity of feelings in consciousness, it would seem to imply that consciousness is always a state of embodied consciousness because there cannot be consciousness without a body, and it's the body that's having the conscious feelings, so one can't have a disembodied consciousness. Now, you could think that one through, that argument through, but it seems to me that if feelings are intrinsic and essential to consciousness, and feelings are experiential states that or conscious states the body has of itself, then one can't have disembodied consciousness because one needs feelings in order to have consciousness. Now I'm going to introduce a second important consideration regarding the nature of emotion and feeling, and this is also going to apply to motivation. And it has to do with a common distinction that we make between cognition, knowing, which includes thinking, and emotion or feeling. Nietzsche made the distinction between a Dionysian mindset, which emphasized sensation, versus an Apollonian mindset, which emphasized reason and thought. We find a similar distinction in Western philosophy between rationalism, to look at the world through reason, versus romanticism, which is to emphasize the emotional and feeling dimension of our existence. So we make this distinction between the emotional feeling dimension of our consciousness and our being and the cognitive knowing thinking dimension. And let's just explore that because there's reasons for thinking that this distinction has validity, and that I'm going to try to demonstrate that it actually is impossible to separate the two. First, people could present the argument that one could have non-cognitive emotions and feelings, like free-floating anxiety. So one could have emotional states that are in some sense without any cognitive feature to it. And people will say things like, go with or listen to your feelings, as if that were something separate and distinct from your thoughts. The counter argument is that it's possible that one could have non-feeling, non-emotional, non-motivational conscious cognition. And we have Mr. Spock, who attempted to operate without taking into account his feelings. And we have data from also not from Star Trek, but from Star Trek 2, who had an emotion chip that he could turn off and on, but could still have cognitive states even without any emotion being experienced. So we have this idea that one could have emotional states without thoughts, and where one could have thought and conscious cognition states without emotion. We have this aspirational goal that one should not let our emotions, our feelings influence our thinking, as if that were possible. We make a distinction between people who seem more emotional and people who seem more rational and thoughtful. Okay. We also sometimes feel as if our emotions and feelings and our thoughts and cognitions could be in conflict with each other. Well, I feel one thing, but I think something different, as if that were possible. Now, the counter argument is going to be that cognition, thinking, knowing, and feeling are not totally separate or independent conscious phenomena, and they cannot exist separately. First of all, if one looks at the wiring and structure of the brain and identifies those parts of the brain that seem to be emotional, motivational areas and those parts that seem to be cognitive areas, the two sets of structures are so intermeshed, interconnected, woven together that neither of them operates in any sense whatsoever independent of the other. That is, it appears from a physiological perspective that it's impossible to have cognitive states independent of emotion or emotional states independent of cognition. And so when we talk about consciousness, we should talk about consciousness as if it's these fused feeling cognitions or cognitive feelings. The two things intermesh together in consciousness. The argument from the phenomenology of emotion is that consciousness is always intentional, that it is always an object of consciousness, and emotion or emotional feeling cannot exist without some kind of cognitive appraisal. That is, I am having an emotion about and some cognitively identified object that I'm having the emotional feeling about. There's always a cognitive reference, and it could be perceptual, it could be through thought and imagery, it could be a self-reference, but there's always a cognitive reference in any emotion. So my emotions always have a reference to some cognitively identified thing that they are about. And the argument from introspection and phenomenology is that feelings and emotions are ubiquitous through consciousness, and one can't have non emotional, non feeling states of consciousness. And this goes all the way back to Wilhelm Wundt and Wilhelm Wundt's uh, introspective study of consciousness. And so consciousness is never simply a state of knowing or believing or being aware of something. Consciousness and always has as a part of it a sense of feeling which is integral to it. And so there's omnipresent feeling and an emotional dimension to consciousness. And so we can't have cognitive states without feelings going along with them. But we can push the argument here about the way in which emotion and thinking or cognition are interwoven together. A very influential theory in psychology is the cognitive theory of emotions. The emotional experiences we have depend on the cognitive interpretations of reality or our bodily states. So if we have different cognitive patterns, they generate different emotions. And this is the foundation of both rational emotive therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy, which is based on the notion that if you change the cognitive interpretations of reality, the thinking or the thoughts I'm having, the emotions will change as a consequence. So the cognitive theory of emotions is basically saying that what you emotionally feel depends upon how you interpret and think about the reality you're in. So they're not separate realities at all. The reverse or the reciprocal is the emotional theory of cognition. The emotions that we are experiencing have a definite, powerful impact on our conscious states. They're causally efficacious, and emotions can dampen or they can excite and energize our cognition, our creativity, our behavior. Emotional states such as anger versus happiness versus sadness have distinctive, consequent, resultant patterns of cognition. So when you are in a happy state, that emotional state generates different thinking patterns than if you're in a sad or depressed state. Damasio goes so far as to say that emotions are really a form of cognition. They're a felt form of cognition. They involve apprehension and evaluation of the environment, and the appraisal that we have, the cognitive appraisals that we have, are felt in emotion. So to know and to feel are reciprocally fused together, and it's relevant to defining the very nature of what emotions are. And this same reciprocity or fusion pertains to cognition and motivation. That is, our desires impact our cognitions, and our cognitions impact our desires and our motivation. Meaning, for example, that there's no dispassionate search for the truth. That is, all of our cognitive processes have motivational desires, goals behind them. Desire invariably has cognitively identified objects of desire. And this is relevant to defining what motivation is. So, emotion and motivation, which involve conscious feeling states, are inextricably fused and linked together with cognitive knowing states. So when I have an emotion, it's not simply a feeling, but it's also a set of cognitions and thoughts and or some people say cognitive appraisals that I have of reality. And you can't separate those two out phenomenologically, consciously. They always come together, they're always fused together. So the feeling dimension of consciousness pertains to states of the body and the body's awareness of its own states. That's what feelings refer to. Feelings, which include both emotional feelings and motivational feelings, are a ubiquitous and essential feature of consciousness. And I'll have some more to say on that in the next part. And feelings and cognition, or knowing states, are essential and interconnected features of both emotion and motivation. So when we talk about what we're feeling, there's always going to be some thoughts and cognitions in it. And when we talk about what we're thinking, there's always going to be some feeling, emotional states connected with it. The two come together. Now, here we'll switch from Terry's graphics to some of my graphics. So let me give you a comprehensive definition of emotion. And here I'm starting from the basic concept of emotions as uh, a mode of a state of consciousness, but it is a psychophysiological gestalt. It's a holistic integrative reality, which includes bodily consciousness of bodily states and arousal and bodily proprioceptive sensations. So when we get emotional, we feel different proprioceptive sensations in our bodies too, as well as the generalized state of arousal. There are behavioral expressions of emotions which actually feed back on and affect our very conscious feelings. There is conscious behavioral engagement in emotional states with the environment. And this brings in the ecological part of emotion, and I'll come to that in a little bit. There is a plethora of neurophysiological and electrochemical correlates to emotional states. There's the cognitive dimension, which I've already introduced. What do I think? about the situation I'm in, which directly impacts what I feel about it and is connected to it. And there's a valence dimension, which is it pleasurable? Is it pleasant? Or is it painful? And that's part of an emotion too. So all of those things come together. I should mention there's a really good review on thinking and research on the topic of emotion in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And I have the link up there if you want to get an in-depth look at how emotions have been studied and thought about scientifically and thought about philosophically. And there's, of course, lots of other general references you could find, but I found the Stanford Encyclopedia article on emotion to be very comprehensive and informative. Now, since my suggestion or proposal from the beginning here has been we need to look at consciousness from an evolutionary perspective. I want to focus in here and look at emotion in particular from an evolutionary perspective. Now, I suggested that emotions are essential to consciousness, but I also said that they're primordial to consciousness, just like perception, purposeful behavior, and proprioception are primordial to consciousness. They're fundamental from the get-go features of consciousness. The idea that emotions exist in animals, in fact, in rather primitive animals, is a feature of two of the most dominant theories of contemporary theories of emotion, Plutchik's and Ekman's theories of emotion. I'm going to talk about both of them, but the idea here is that emotions are not something that emerges in humans. They're not even something that probably emerges in mammals. There's something that is part of consciousness that uh, emerged much earlier. That is, conscious feeling states of the body and distinguishing distinctive feeling states of the body with respect to things like danger and sources of food or mating. That goes way, way back into the history of the evolution of animal life. Emotion and motivation are located, the areas that are involved in them are located in subcortical structures which emerge very early in animals. And so, even though there has been this ongoing debate regarding whether animals experience emotions, and the arguments have been presented that we anthropomorphize animals when we ascribe emotions to them. This is like Descartes' argument that animals are non-conscious machines. The different kinds of emotions that researchers believe they have identified in animals, which includes very primitive animals like bees and crayfish, and not just primates, is rather extensive. And the contemporary view on emotions and animals is that animals definitely have a variety, experience a variety of different emotions. And now keep in mind, emotions here means, at least in part, the conscious experience of generalized states of the body with respect to very important aspects of the world and oneself, like anger or aggression or loving or sadness. And in fact, the argument Darwin believed that animals had emotions and that there were certain fundamental emotions that we see across all animals, including humans. So questions like, do animals experience desire? Do animals experience pleasure and pain? Do animals experience feelings in the broad sense or emotional feelings, which are a particular subset of feelings? I think contemporary thinking is that the answer on all of those is going to be yes. And we could talk to, of course, people who have animals Like we have a cat and Jeannie sitting there thinking maybe about, does Pookie experience desires? Okay, she has something there. What is she doing? Um, okay. Or do animals experience pleasure and pain? Uh, It really appears definitely that they do experience pleasure and pain. So the general sense is that emotional feelings in particular, and feelings in general, are something that we find way back in the early history of the evolution of animals. And I'm including it as a primordial feature of all consciousness. That is, to be conscious means to have feelings, and in particular, at least in some fundamental sense, to have emotional feelings. And the consensus of opinion is that animals do have emotional feelings. Now, a second evolutionary perspective, and I'm citing the same three people again who have studied emotions and studied animal emotions, Darwin, Ekman, and Plotchik, is that um, emotions are conscious responses to key environmental factors and life challenges. That is, they have evolved as a way of addressing and adaptively responding to certain fundamental meanings and values that the environment possesses for animals in order for animals to continue to exist. That is, emotions have this ecological nature to them. So let's just unpack what that means. What's the relationship between emotion and perception and purposeful behavior? Now, perception is a form of cognition, a sensory form of cognition and knowing. And I had brought up the idea early on in the webinar series that when we perceive, we don't simply perceive facts of the environment, we perceive meanings and affordances or values the environment has for us. So the objects of cognition in primordial emotions are apprehended and identified through perception. We perceive that something is dangerous. We perceive that something is dangerous is connected up with things like either fear or anxiety or anger. Those will be accompanying emotional experiences that we have in the in the perceptual cognition of things in reality. So when we perceive the world as having value positively and negative, and connected with that is going to be this emotional reaction to those perceived values. So, although emotion and motivation are feeling states, they're also ecological phenomena because they involve bodily feelings about things in the world, about affordances and values that we perceive in the environment. They're outer directed about the environment, the reality perceiving, but also they're self-reflective too. So I can have emotional feelings or motivational desires with respect to my own state. I could feel depressed about the way I am, or I could feel motivated to do something about the way I am. So emotions and motivation can make reference to oneself as well as make reference to things out in the environment. Now, the connection between purposeful behavior and emotion is that different emotions appear to be associated with different types of behavior, specific to the meanings and values of the environment and the appropriate responses to those kinds of meanings. So, if something is dangerous and I feel fear, the associated behavior, purposeful behavior, will be to run and hide from danger. That is, in states of fear or freeze, too. When I'm angry as an emotional state, I attack or I threaten the perceived object. Okay. Or if I can withdraw, avoid, as try to escape from a perceived aversive reality. In fact, William James, the American psychologist, went so far as to say that different types of behavior are what cause the different emotions. So instead of saying that I run because I'm afraid, James would say, I'm afraid because I run. And the answer, I think, is going to be a feedback loop. If one starts to feel fear toward a perceived, cognitively apprehended object that's dangerous, then if one starts to run from it, one intensifies, and there's a physiological feedback effect here, one's experience of fear. Okay, so it's a loop. Uh, Ekman goes so far as to say that the different primary emotions, and we'll talk about those primary emotions in a minute, are associated with very distinctive and universal facial expressions. So when people are happy, the distinctive facial expression of happiness is very perceptually salient to people across the globe. That is, across the globe, when people are happy, their faces look basically about the same. When they're angry, there's a change in the facial expression. And in fact, not only do the facial expressions of emotion correlate up with particular emotions, but manifesting those facial expressions actually will intensify and influence further the emotional experience of that emotion. So if you get the idea here is that purposeful behaviors are associated with different emotional conscious states, but those purposeful behaviors associated with those different emotional conscious states actually loop and further intensify, affect those very emotional states. So behavior and emotion, purposeful behavior and emotion, are connected together, as well as perception as a mode of cognition being connected together with conscious states of emotion. So if we think about primordial consciousness involving perception and purposeful behavior is going to be linked up together with primordial emotional consciousness, and the different distinctive emotional feelings get connected with different kinds of behaviors and get connected with the apprehension of different types of features of the environment, which are of significance to the actual survival of that animal or a species. Now, I'd already brought this up from last time, but Ekman and others, and this has been a common view, probably goes all the way back to Darwin, is that there seemed to be an innate set, an inherited set of primary emotions that emerged and evolved with animals that we possess ourselves. And Ekman suggests happiness, sadness, anger, fear, um, disgust, and later on he added in contempt. I suggest perhaps you might add in love, hate, grief, and hope. Different people have suggested other primary emotions. What are the basic emotions that all humans experience, for which there are distinctive facial expressions? And all these emotions we find at least in primate animals. That's Ekman's idea. That's the question, what they would be. And all of the other emotions are treated as secondary and evolve and develop off of the primary ones. So there's ongoing debate about which ones are primary, which ones are secondary, but there's this common view there is a set of primary emotions. And the secondary emotions can be looked at as a result of learning or as combinations of the primary ones, but it appears as if there's a fundamental evolutionary core of primary emotions that all humans possess and that we share with at least more evolved animals, mammals and primates, maybe and whales and porpoises, dolphins, etc. Now, one particular idea that comes out of this is the idea of emotional wheels. Now, Plotchik is one person who has proposed a model of emotions based upon a wheel graphic, but I have to mention he's not by any means the only one. And it's a way to visualize primary fundamental emotions and secondary derivative emotions. And the common theme in these wheel models is to represent the fundamental emotions as basic polarities. And with Plotchik, he would also argue that these primary emotions are associated with distinctive types of behavior. That was the theme I brought up a bit earlier, that emotions are connected with different types of adaptive purposeful behaviors. And there's different wheel diagrams who propose different fundamental sets of primary emotions. But with Plotchik, who is one of the most has been one of the most influential thinkers in the psychology of emotion, he has eight that he identifies. And here is his wheel. I would go look at the website because I can't go into great detail on his representation of the eight fundamental emotions. But the thing to note here is that he arranges them in oppositional pairs. So the eight fundamental emotions are joy, which is the opposite of sadness. And in terms of oppositional behaviors, joy stimulates the behavior of to connect, where sadness stimulates behaviors of withdraw, reverse behaviors. Fear is the opposite of anger, to get small and high versus get big and loud. Anticipation, which he lists as an emotion, interestingly, is the opposite of surprise. Examine more closely versus jump back. Disgust is the opposite of trust, with the oppositional behaviors being to reject versus to embrace. Two key things to notice here are that the primary emotions are arranged oppositionally, and each set of basic oppositional emotions is associated with fundamental oppositional modes of behavior. And there's a lot more depth I can go into here, which is the intensity of them, which is mapped out on the wheel there, and combinations of them, which is also mapped out on the wheel there too. But keep in mind, this is a common model, contemporary model of how to conceptualize in a broad integrative picture the primary emotions and derivative secondary emotions, is that they all lie on some kind of oppositional wheel. Now, I want to come back to this theme of pleasure and pain, because pleasure and pain definitely connects into our thinking and understanding of emotions. In that emotions, feelings in general, can be either pleasurable or they can be painful. And they're associated with different types of behavioral responses, with having certain motivational features to them, having a reciprocity dimension, and also our feelings that we have. And all of that has to do with this basic hedonic polarity dimension of emotion. And by that, I mean simply that there's a polarity in our total set of emotions that fundamentally runs from those that are pleasurable to those that are more painful and aversive. So, pleasure and pain is a fundamental feeling opposition in human and animal consciousness. And it's connected with two fundamental forms of behavior. The hedonic theory, the pleasure pain theory of motivation, is that humans and animals will approach, move toward pleasurable states and will escape or avoid from painful states, or pleasurable environmental conditions they come toward, painful environmental conditions they pull back from. So the two fundamental basic types of emotion are connected with two fundamental basic types of behavior, oppositional in nature. Feel good versus feel bad, come toward versus pull back from. And this is a generalized model of human and animal motivation that lots of people have presented over the years. And notice it's an oppositional view both of emotion, pleasurable versus painful, and motivation, approach versus avoid, and behavior going with it. Oop, there we go. Sorry. And notice we're still with my jazzy psychedelic graphics in the back. Now, here we come to an interesting connection between emotions and motivation, in that even though I've been talking about them in some ways as being different, in some ways they're very intimately connected together, in that emotions can have motivational power, in that, number one, uh, the different emotions we have are connected with fundamental different kinds of motivated behaviors. So when I approach or go towards something which is I see as pleasurable, there are certain emotions I feel, which would be joy or in some kind of anticipatory enthusiasm, versus when I run from something, an avoidance motivated behavior, because I anticipate pain or I'm actually experiencing it, I have certain emotions that are very different that go along with that. But we can even get to the point where emotions can be motives and motivate our behavior. So different emotions will motivate different kinds of behaviors in us. So it's not simply that when I run from something that I perceive as painful or dangerous, I feel fear. The very fear itself becomes motivating, causing that behavior. So the pleasure pain opposition in emotions and in motivation makes it look as if consciousness can be thought of as a reciprocal polarity of toward things that are pleasant and we go toward versus things that are painful and we try to avoid. Now, people have talked about, well, maybe there's ways to get rid of negative emotionality. Maybe it's not a good thing. Maybe pain's not a good thing. But I have a discussion in my Future Consciousness book on why the negative emotions, why those painful conscious states, or people will call them unpleasant conscious states, actually have value. I mean, one of them would simply be that, well, you can't understand or appreciate pleasure without having experienced pain, blah, 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 that kind of thing. Um, and so even though there is a painful and pleasant dimension to emotions, that they have value. And Damasio presents a very strong argument that if we didn't feel fear, we would lose certain adaptive qualities to our behavior and our cognition, and we wouldn't function as well. So fear is actually a good thing to feel if the situation is dangerous and warrants it. And this reciprocity applies to the feeling dimension of emotions. Feelings are states of the body being conscious of itself. Each emotion has a distinctive feel with distinctive physiological changes. These are diffuse bodily states that we feel. They're generalized states of the body. These emotional feelings can be pleasurable or painful. There's a hedonic opposition or relationship. And even the theory that emotions are felt states of arousal in the body is a bit misleading because you could have agitating, highly aroused emotions like hatred and terror, or relatively calm and relaxing kind of emotions like bliss. And this difference between those agitated types of emotions and those calm types of emotions pertains to another reciprocal physiological system in the body between the sympathetic and parasympathetic, which is associated with stress preparedness, tension versus relaxation and calm. So the difference here is between emotions that actually get us into sympathetically aroused states of being prepared for danger and we get into states of tension versus relaxing kinds of emotion when we feel content and peaceful. And actually, our emotional states show oscillation through our regular rest activity cycle to go along with all of that. Okay, so right at this point, I got about 10 minutes after 11. I think it might be a good place to take a little break, look at comments, have a little discussion. And so I'm going to escape. We have a set of other important points to make about emotions. Item number one is emotions change throughout our conscious waking life. It's part of the generalized flow of consciousness. Uh, we can make a distinction, which is often made, between emotions which are more short term versus mood states, which are somewhat longer term. But we also use the word moody to refer to people whose emotions or emotional states can change dramatically and quickly as opposed to be relatively stable. And we have things like this a psychological pattern of a manic depressive temperament as a lifelong generalized type of bipolar emotional consciousness. Emotional conscious states, though, are relatively long term in comparison with thoughts. Thoughts come and go rather quickly. Once one gets angry or one gets fearful, it takes a bit longer for the emotional state to dissipate. Okay. Emotions change as a result of new environmental events or new challenges being introduced where there's a quick, sudden arousal of like fear or anger or a love or attraction. So there's more longer term features to emotional consciousness. There's transforming features to emotional consciousness going on through the entire waking day. The question has come up whether you could have unconscious emotions, and Freud's theory of the unconscious gives some credibility to that idea, but there's the counter argument that one can't have an emotion unless one's conscious of the emotion because feelings by definition imply consciousness. But there's the whole area of research on emotional intelligence that one can have degrees of awareness or self-awareness of one's emotional states. That is, although emotions are presumably a conscious feeling, conceptualized, cognitized, behaviorally engaged type of state, one can be relatively unaware of what one is feeling, and one can get better at it, which is behind the whole notion of the development of emotional intelligence. So I think there can be degrees of conscious clarity that one has about what emotions you're feeling and how they're influencing your thinking and behavior, because I think the distinction between the unconscious and the conscious is blurry. That is, it's not like either you're conscious of it or you're not conscious of the emotion. Rather, you could be to different degrees and different levels of acuity aware of your various emotions that you're feeling. And even though they may be affecting your behavior and your thinking, you're not all that clear about them. And it looks as if some people are better and more attuned to being able to identify what emotions they're feeling than what other people are able to identify. So it's kind of a yes and no on the issue of can you be experiencing emotions without being clearly aware of what emotions they are? Um, and lots of things come into play in terms of how clear your sense is of what you're feeling at that point in time. A question that I spend a lot of time with in my book on future consciousness is can emotions be voluntarily and purposefully controlled? The cognitive theory of emotion says that indeed they can by changing your thought patterns. I think it's a challenge to volitionally, purposefully modify or direct your various emotions, emotional states, but I think it's something that's achievable. And you could argue that a generalized, more happy emotional state through the day is something that can be accomplished with work. You can alter your various emotions that you're feeling and the preponderance of negative versus positive ones. But and also emotions don't just simply apply to what you're experiencing right now, they also apply to your past, what you remember. You have feelings about past experiences, and you have emotional feelings about the future too. And this definitely is of significance to understanding future consciousness, because I think that's something that gets ignored in a lot of thinking about our awareness and our addressing of the future is the whole dimension of emotion. That is, people could have generalized fearful emotional states with respect to the anticipated future, or more happy, elated, confident emotional states with respect to the future too. And that definitely impacts how we think about and how we behave with respect to the future. So emotion isn't something that simply colors our engagement with the present and colors and structures our sense of our past. It also definitely impacts our purposeful behavior and our thinking with respect to the future. There's a very powerful interpersonal dimension to emotion. That is, emotions, I think, are actually contagious. If you're around happy, elated people, I think that has a positive effect on your own emotional states. And this is in part connected to the intersubjective public dimension of consciousness, that we're aware of the consciousness of others, in particular, the emotional consciousness of others. And we actually, in our various philosophical systems and cultures, attempt to shape and teach emotions. Our philosophies of life don't just simply provide cognitive frameworks, they encourage, reinforce emotional dispositions. So, emotions we can see as something that we individually possess, but at the same time, we as social creatures live and interact in the context of other social creatures, and what others are feeling and what others believe directly impacts on our own emotional states and vice versa. Now, I just put up here a list of examples of different kinds of emotions, like the feeling of helplessness, pessimism, passion, lust, distress, frustration. I have a long list here. It's not intended to be complete, but there are obviously what we call the primary ones, whatever those primary ones are. There are secondary ones, and there's lots of others I'm sure other people could put up here. But the complexity of our emotional consciousness is very, very rich. And uh, and as we develop psychologically, new kinds of emotions, more nuanced types of emotions can come in, and you could add to, subtract from this list, and other ones that are very important I may have missed up here. But I just wanted to show off the top of my head uh, what uh, the rich set of different emotions that one may have about the world and about oneself. Now, the connection between motivation and emotion. Animals and humans are both emotional and motivational conscious beings. And both of those aspects of consciousness, I think, are primordial, and we see them in animals as much as we see them in humans. And emotions and motivations are interconnected together. So emotions can motivate, they can become motives like fear and anger, and they are often concomitantly experienced when we are in motivational states. Uh, and both of them have feeling dimensions. So we feel our emotions and we can feel our motives in different types of ways too, as desires and wants. So the two are connected together in consciousness and they're pervasive. So let me give a definition of motivation. The term motive can refer to the cause or reason behind some behavior. It's a concept that's used to explain behavior. It's used to explain the directional flow and content of consciousness. In fact, motivation is a central psychological concept in that it refers to identifying the causes and the aspirations and goals of conscious beings. The term motive can be used to refer to desires, wants, values, and needs which instigate behavior. Motives can even be unconscious, but desires are often distinctive conscious feelings. Motivational psychology is about what people and animals want and value, and how such wants and values determine their behavior. If we conceive of a motive as a state of desire or wanting, a motive energizes, impetus propelling behavior in the flow of consciousness. Motivation is often understood as a state of arousal. And the intent of the state of arousal is to reduce that arousal. So motives can be seen as antecedent causes, that which triggers off behavior, where something in the past or something, particularly in the present, is instigating me into doing something. I'm hungry, or I'm ambitious, or I want to be famous, or I want to fix the sink, whatever the hell it happens to be, is an antecedent cause, concurrent cause, making the behavior, propelling it. But the concept of motives or motivation is also intricately connected with the concept of purpose, which I define as intention, aim, or goal. Behavior and consciousness is invariably directed toward the achievement of goals and ends, and a motive can refer to the intended goal or direction of the behavior and consciousness. Because motives have the quality of purpose, they are future directional. That is, the purposeful behavior is directed toward the realization of some future state of affairs. Future consciousness at its primordial level is motivational consciousness. That is, it's consciousness directed toward some goal that I'm intending to realize in the immediate or far distant future. But keep in mind that motivation, from what I said before, has an affective feeling dimension too. So my future consciousness at a primordial motivational level isn't simply thoughts and images, but it's desires and feelings about something that I'm anticipating or wanting. If I synthesize these two features of motivation together, motivation is the purposeful and energized intent and effort to satisfy wants or desires through the achievement of goals. Motivation as purpose identifies a future goal or intent. When I'm motivated, I'm thinking about focusing on something I hope to achieve. And as a current energizing force, it propels me toward that goal or intent. That is, motivational consciousness directs and energizes purposeful behavior. That's what it's all about. Most behavior, most of it, almost all of it, and a good deal of the flow of consciousness is motivational and purposeful. That is, I act in order to achieve something. And even simple things like primordial reflexes can and are influenced by intention and motivation and are not simply reactions. So almost all behavior and a lot of the flow of consciousness is motivational and purposeful, directed towards something, energized towards something, wanting something. And just like emotion, motivation is a psychophysiological gestalt. It includes experienced desires, it includes experienced emotions going along with it. There's a pleasure pain dimension, there's a cognitive, interpretive, imaginative dimension, there's bodily arousal, there's a perceptual dimension to it, there's a behavioral dimension, and there's a value valence dimension. So if I go through that, when I'm motivated, I feel desires and wants. There's often accompanying conscious emotions. And these emotions, actually, like fear or anger, can become motives in and of themselves. That is, consciousness is usually effectively and emotionally colored, and that includes motivational consciousness. There's a hedonic pleasure pain dimension. The one general theory I brought up before is that humans and animals in general are motivated to seek, create, or maximize pleasure and to avoid, escape, minimize pain. And the emotional variation on that thesis is that we seek pleasurable emotions and we attempt to avoid or escape from negative emotions. So emotions and the pleasure pain dichotomy is integral to understanding motivation. Humans seek happiness and love and avoid fear, anxiety, depression, and sadness. And they try to escape from it if they're in it, if they can. But they may feel powerless in doing that too. I should add that in. It just popped into my head. Motives often get consciously articulated and evolved as thoughts and as images. In fact, we often rationalize or reason out why we go after, why we desire some goal that we see as valuable or good. We think about our goals and we think about and plan out our actions for achieving goals. And these thoughts and imagery is often with feelings going along with them. So thinking is a key dimension of motivational consciousness as well as feeling, because when we are motivated and purposeful, we are thinking about what it is that we want to achieve and how to go about doing it. Motives can be thought through and through inner-directed reasoning, strengthened and developed. That is, we can actually enhance the power of certain motives in us through considering the value and the purpose behind those motives. There's proprioceptual arousal features to motivation. There's perceptual things that happen during motivational consciousness. We identify the objects of our desire and value through perception. We perceive objects as having a valence, positive or negative. The purposeful dimension involving habits of behavior. We engage in behaviors to achieve our goals, but those behaviors themselves, such as addictions, both positive and negative, they could become motives in themselves. So no longer do I act to realize a goal, but after a while, the very act itself can become the motive to just do it over and over again. That is, the purposeful behavior, which begins as a means to an end, can become an end in itself. And in that regard, motives can be strengthened through practicing or repeating the relevant motivated behavior. You can strengthen a motive by repeatedly engaging in the achievement of that motive. Human values are motives, whether they're ideals or standards, and they motivate behavior. We identify desirable and preferable goals, which could be ethical or moral principles, and those can motivate us too. A lot of our behavior, in one way or other, has as its motives different values. They're cognitively articulated. They also have emotional feelings to them. So, fundamental values like justice and fairness, honesty and truth, self determination, beauty, courage, all of those are fundamental human human motives identified as goals which we try to realize, and they're identified and articulated cognitively, and they generate associated emotions with them, and we move toward the realization and of those various values. So ethics and morals are part of motivational psychology in that they move us, they give us goals, we cognitively articulate them, and we behave and do things in order to realize them. So all these different factors are part of the psychophysiological gestalt of motivation, all coming together and impacting each other. Now, I just threw in another one of my psychedelic images because just like with emotions, I sat and thought about what are some different kinds of basic human motives. And I just came up with survival, hunger, sexual desire, desire for rest, relaxation, achievement motivation, which has been studied a lot, the realization of excellence, becoming popular. Conquest is a motive, power, destruction, wealth is a motive, love, compassion is a motive. Protecting and nurturing is a motive. Companionship, desire for it is a motive. Safety and security, self esteem, self actualization, curiosity, learning, enlightenment is a motive. The search for it. Excitement and adventure could be a motive. Finding the meaning in life could be a motive. Reverence and worship, anger and revenge. To contribute to the improvement, advance of the human condition is a motive. All of these are different kinds of motives that can develop, emerge in us. Maybe there are some primary ones. We'll talk about that in a moment, but there's a huge range of different motives that can become powerful causative factors with identified goals and behaviors that humans can engage in consciously. Um, there's a lot of temporal variation and intensity in motives. An experience motive can feel either intense or it can feel weak. Motives can arise and dissipate. If you were to stop and think throughout the day regarding your flow of consciousness, you would identify hundreds and hundreds of individual short-term motives that emerge in consciousness. You execute the appropriate behavior to realize them, and then they dissipate, and another motive comes up. Motives are connected with biological rhythms, in fact. Parts of the day, I have motivation for certain kinds of things. Parts of the day, I may have other motives that are different. Motives can be relatively short term, like I'm thirsty and I get a glass of water, that's it. Okay. They can be very long term. In fact, in philosophy and study of future consciousness, there's the whole concept of deep purpose. Can we have some holistic long term directionality to our motivational behavior and our motivated consciousness that influences and dominates our behavior through our lives? I have a section in Future Consciousness on the whole concept of deep purpose, long term, holistic directionality to our purposeful behavior and consciousness. Sometimes people have distinguished between basic physiological, biological motives and psychological motives, say, for example, in Maslow's hierarchy, but I think this dualistic is a dualistic perspective. Biological motives also always have a psychological element, and psychosocial motives have biological aspects. We can distinguish between primordial advanced motives and that early animals, early life forms had primordial motives, and as life evolved, new motives developed. And in our early life, we had primordial motives like contact and attachment, and other ones developed as we matured. And so, either in evolution or in human development, maybe there are primordial ones and then there are more advanced ones that come along. This is what Maslow has in his hierarchy. But the problem in Maslow's hierarchy is that advanced qualities of motives on the top of the hierarchy can develop at the primordial level too. So even though sex and hunger, Maslow identifies as primordial, they can become very elaborate motives in involving learning, cognition, aesthetics, and skill. So this distinction between what are advanced and what are more primordial, what's biological versus psychological, they're very fuzzy wuzzy. And things that seem to be more primordial can show lots of features of more advanced motives. There's also the related theory that some motives are instinctual versus some are learned. The counter argument is that all motives are a combination of the two. So I think all those distinctions kind of break down as to human motivation and animal motivation. I mentioned already the fundamental distinction that's made between two basic types of motivation, approach versus avoidance motivation, as a general dividing line where avoidance is being motivated with the experience of fear, anxiety to eliminate or escape from something versus approach motivation driven with hope, curiosity, toward pleasure, affiliation, toward a desirable object. You can question this distinction in that anytime I act, there's always something I'm trying to move toward and something I'm trying to move away from. But some people seem to be more dominated in their consciousness by approach, hope, and pleasure, and other people seem to be more dominated in their consciousness by avoidance, fear, and pain. There's the related polarity of optimism versus pessimism, expectations of positive versus negative futures, which is connected with the self assessments of self efficacy versus helplessness. Pessimistic people feel more helpless, optimistic people feel more self efficacious. Uh, so, um, the optimism pessimism one I talk about in my future consciousness book too, and um, those two states can intensify or dampen your generalized motivational consciousness. So if you tend to be more optimistic, you have more energized motivational states. If you tend to be more pessimistic, you tend to have more depressed and subdued motivational states. Maslow also throws out the distinction between deficiency versus growth motivation, where deficiency motivation is the elimination of a deficiency, and growth motivation is the addition or accumulation of some kind of reality. And this lines up with the escape versus avoidance, the escape avoidance versus approach distinction in motivation. Maslow sees the biological needs as deficiency motivated and self-actualization as growth motivated. Now, that distinction between those two types of motives is connected with another distinction that's made between stability motivation, homeostasis, and change motivation. That is, stability seems to be a very powerful factor in human and animal motivation. And but it looks as if nature in general is a weaving together combination of both stability and change. And purposeful evolution clearly is motivated behavior, motivated thinking toward change. So the argument could be made that people and animals seek a balance between stability and change. Either extreme psychologically is aversive. That is, too much change makes us anxious, too much stability makes us bored and frustrated. There is the argument that stability, homeostasis, and survival is the master motive, the primary motive. But it seems to me that change and evolution is just as important and just as powerful. And it seems to me that change and stability, as polar opposites of fundamental emotions, do I want to change things? Do I want to keep things stable? That they each require each other. They're a reciprocity. There's another distinction in motivational thinking between drive arousal reduction and drive arousal induction. That is, do humans seek and desire calm and peace, or do humans seek and desire stimulation? Or is it both? Is it some kind of balance between the two? Does motivated action decrease or increase the desire to engage in that action? Drive reduction would say that when you eat, you're motivated to eat, you're hungry. After you eat, that reduces the desire to eat more, reduces your state of hunger. Drive induction says eating actually motivates you into eating more. Not right at the moment, but over time, the very act of engaging in that behavior of eating to reduce hunger gets you eating more. Certain variations on that will be the more you eat, the more you want to eat. The more you sleep, the more you want to sleep. The issue of unconscious motives, we're back to Freud again, just like with unconscious emotions. Can we have unconscious motives? Things that are causes, instigators, purposes of our behavior, of our thinking that we're not conscious of. In Freud, we have the twin reciprocal forces of eros and thanatos as basic biological desires. And those exist at the unconscious level. We can have repressed motivating factors. Do we consciously know what is motivating our flow of consciousness and behavior? And like I said before, the distinction between consciousness and the unconscious, I feel, is blurred and comes in degrees. But definitely, I could see some validity in Freud's idea that there can be motives that are having a powerful impact on the flow of our consciousness, things we want, goals we have, purposes that we are not that consciously aware of. So, part of, if we want to call it motivational intelligence, like we have emotional intelligence, may be to become more attuned to and aware of what is actually motivating us to do what we do. Are we all that certain we know? Now, we can have motivational conflicts too. We can have two or more values or motives that are opposed to each other. That is, that in a certain situation, I may want X, but I also may want Y, and Y and X are in some sense incompatible with each other. So, our motivational consciousness doesn't have to be consistent. We may have various motives that in different ways are incompatible with each other. And our consciousness may not be, because of that, unified and harmonious. Now, the theory of cognitive dissonance says that humans find aversive conflicts and contradictions in their state of consciousness. So that if I am in states of motivational or belief conflict, that I will do things to try to reduce or eliminate that conflict. I'm not sure about that, but it's a point worth considering because we definitely seem to get into motivational conflicts, and our consciousness is not unified and harmonious. And I should add in there, that isn't necessarily a bad thing, but clearly it seems like it happens. Our consciousness has conflicts of desires and values within it. And maybe we do, maybe we don't try to eliminate them, try to reduce them. Cognitive dissonance says we will make the attempt at least. Just like with emotion, there's a very significant social interpersonal dimension to motives. Cultures and societies emphasize and teach various central values, ideals, and aspirations. Motives are selectively taught and reinforced with the ideal that the developing members of that society or culture should desire the pursuit of those values. It's not enough simply that we want to, as a society, get you to pursue certain goals. You should believe and want to pursue those goals. That's part of the education that occurs socially within our own development. Lots of people have pointed out that a fundamental difference between Eastern and Western values is a polarity between conformity, more emphasis on that in the East, versus individual expression in the West. Now, how definite that is another question, but clearly it looks as if different cultures will select out, teach, reinforce, and attempt to almost literally indoctrinate its members into pursuing this set of values and this set of motives as primary versus that set. So societies and cultures definitely have a significant impact on which motives become central and most important in a person's consciousness. Now, we can talk about biological motives as something across all humans versus socially learned motives, but E.O. Wilson presents a very convincing argument that all our basic social motives are actually innate and biological to begin with. That is, wanting desires to work and cooperate together, to compete, etc. Now, there's a huge variety of motives pertaining to our social relationships, different fundamental ones that involve other people. The motive to cooperate, to compete, to nurture, to have companionship, to have a sense of belongingness, retribution, revenge, romance, and sex. All of those basic human motives pertain to social relationships. Now, just like with emotion, the question has come up in motivation are there some one or two master motives, underlying motives, that are the foundation for all other human motives? Aristotle proposed that happiness was the fundamental motive that propelled humanity. That is, we desire to be happy, depending on what you mean by happy, too. Antonio Damasio, taking a physiological perspective, says that the fundamental motive underlying all of life is homeostasis, balance. I don't know if I agree with that. Nietzsche, on the other hand, said that all humans are motivated toward power. That's what really motivates us. Freud said it's creation and destruction, eros and thanatos, complementary, oppositional motives as primary. Another one that's proposed is on one hand, I'm motivated toward individuation. On the other hand, complementarily, I'm motivated to belong and being part of the whole. Those are the two master motives. Hedonism says that the two master motives, which are reciprocals, are to approach pleasure and avoid pain. Carl Jung said it's to achieve wholeness. Other people say it's to achieve balance. Another view, which I talked about a bit, is the two primary motives are towards stability versus change and growth. Those two are always at odds and foundational to everything. Carl Rogers says the fundamental motive is self actualization. So, this is a question that people have debated, but it's a very important question in this regard because when we ask what the master motive or motives are in human consciousness, what we're asking is what is the core of human nature? What is it underneath that fundamentally drives us, that propels us? What is our deepest fundamental goal or goals? What do we do? What are we up to when we live? What is really propelling us in the flow of our consciousness and also in our behavior? Now, two closing final points here. Um, Number one, I could say that the central issue regarding the purposeful evolution of consciousness, our future purposeful evolution, can be framed as the selective evolution and development of what will be our central conscious motives. What should we attempt to strengthen and enhance in us that will drive and direct our consciousness and behavior? And this gets at the core of our understanding of consciousness in the future. And I would put in emotion as essential to that as well in terms of envisioning the future of consciousness. Now, I want to highlight here what I'm trying to articulate by contrast. When people talk about the future evolution or development of humanity, of consciousness, of the mind, whatever, they have a tendency to drift into issues regarding the further cognitive evolution of humanity and consciousness, of thinking, of intelligence. Whereas what I'm presenting here is that the central issue in envisioning a preferable future evolution of consciousness has to do with our motivational and emotional consciousness because it's our motivational consciousness, which is the part of our consciousness that is articulating the fundamental goals, aspirations, ideals, desires, and drives of human consciousness. Because we could decide based on various deliberations that heightening our intelligence is maybe not a good thing, that it may be better to heighten our emotionality. It may be better to become more socially in tune with each other, whatever, we could have alternative views there. So we really, in thinking about the purposeful evolution of consciousness, we really are thinking about, at its core, what is it that's going to move and direct us as future conscious beings? And the second point, main concluding point, is that emotion and motivation are core features of consciousness. You can't ignore them. They're fundamental, they're primordial. And those core features are ecological and evolutionary. They're both psychophysiological gestalts involving the body, behavior, feeling, cognition, values, and they're both evolutionary in that they both are dynamic, evolving. They didn't just emerge with us, and they're both ecological, involving engagement with the world. And so emotional and motivational consciousness can be seen as aligning with this general theory I'm developing, that consciousness is an evolutionary and ecological reality. It's not something simply in the head or in the mind. It's something that involves our gestalt in the world, and it's a dynamic gestalt that's been evolving and continues to evolve. So, surprisingly, I got through that whole thing. I'm making a little joke there. Next time, I'm going to talk about the cosmology, ecology, and biology of consciousness. I'm going to move over more into the physical features and dimensions and support of our consciousness, and not just simply the brain, but our ecology and our general biology too, and the very physical reality that we exist within. So, emotion and motivation tended to focus more on our experiential aspects, although I include physical aspects. The next one, in probably about a month, I'll do the cosmological setting of consciousness, the ecological constraints of consciousness, and the biology of consciousness, which will all be more of a more physical nature in terms of what I'll be covering. And again, continuing to talk on this relationship between consciousness and physicality. I should note that in this last one, if my conclusions are correct and feeling was a fundamental feature of consciousness, and feeling only exists insofar as one has a body, because feeling is the body being aware of itself, then in some sense, having a body is necessary for having consciousness. Okay, so thank you. That's the end. And I actually finished on time. I'm happy about that.